Hey, what's up, and welcome to this episode of Rainer on Leadership. My name is Josh.
My name is Sam, and Josh, are you familiar with the millennial pause? You ever heard that phrase?
I haven't. No. What is that?
So, when you and I started recording stuff on phones and things, you would hit the button and it wouldn't record right away. And so you had to pause. So millennials are notorious. Now phones Gen Z makes fun of us now because we pause. But you don't. That was my point, is you just, boom. You just
Well, there's a
roll
nice little
right
countdown that appears on my screen, and I'm sitting on go. When it says 1-0, I go. So, but that's an interesting thing. I'm going to start looking for that. I've
you
noticed
should.
with our people are giving greetings at the church, if they're of a certain generation, they will use backslash when they're talking about our web address. So they'll say fbclewisville.org/give. When they're younger, they just say slash. So that's a thing I've noticed that's similar.
All those Gen Z kids, I have 4 of them that I now parent. Well, hey, we've got a great episode. We're going to be talking about continual education in your church. We have the expert to do this, and I'm very excited to have Timothy Paul Jones with us. Welcome to the show.
It's great to be with you.
So Timothy is, or TPJ as he is known. So we have Joe Wiki interviewing TPJ today, which is really confusing to me, but I'm going to do my best. So
Sam, you need some sort of, nickname. We could call you Sarah if you want to, or
no, that's
Rainier?
just no. Rainier, there you go.
Okay,
I've heard that one before. So this is a great topic, and it also connects to our sponsor, Southern Seminary, and they have a new fully online PhD program, which fits right into what we are talking about. If you haven't looked into this, you should. A lot of you listeners have thought about doctoral work. I know you have. I've been among you once, and then I was like, you know what? I'm going to go do this, and you should go check out Southern Seminary. This new fully online PhD program. You get the same professors, you get the same interaction. It's a really unique experience with some of the best in the world. Southern Seminary dates back all the way to 1892, and they would love to include you. So go check it out. There's a link in the show notes for you to go see the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. All right, Timothy, I'm excited about today. I'm excited to talk to you. You are a professor of apologetics and family ministry, if I have that correct. If I remember asking you before the show, like 3 minutes ago, if I have my memory correct. Continual learning is a philosophy of like growing over your lifetime. I think most people can kind of grasp that from the title. Why is this important to the church?
Well, one of the things I think we ought to think about first is just what continual learning might look like in the church. I think that's an important thing for us to consider, because some people are really practical people out there. They're going to say, okay, you're saying this, how do I do this in my church? So let's frame this out just a little bit and then fill in the importance of it. So if you think about an attitude that doesn't have a disposition toward continual learning in the church, it's going to look like your typical traditional week by week. You have the same class over and over and over. There's no particular endpoint in it. It's at the same level all the time. It's in the same format all the time. And it simply maintains what's already there. That's what happens in a church. If we want to foster in people's lives, if we want to cultivate in people's lives growth, not merely maintenance, but growth. And let me say, there are some places and times when a maintenance mentality, or at least some maintenance opportunities, are okay. It's not saying that's always bad. I'm not trying to convey that it's always bad. But in addition to having some opportunities to maintain where we're at, we want to have, as you've indicated in here, this notion of you need to grow, of being able to be motivated to grow. Well, how do we cultivate that in a church? How do we do this continual learning type of an attitude and disposition in our churches? Well, I think one of the most important things, having done this both as a pastor and encouraged it as a professor, one of the main things that we often lack, and this is helps us get to the question of how does this help people? Why is it important for people? We want people to grow, but if we're going to grow and if we're going to develop that continual learning attitude so that people do, we have to build into their lives milestones and checkpoints. There has to be things that they're aiming toward. Nobody ever moves toward a continual learning attitude if you don't give them an endpoint, a goal, a checkpoint they're going for. Nobody grows toward that. So part of it is, this is why it's important for people, is that God created us for goals, and continual learning puts goals in front of us. That's a really important thing. It has to do with how God designed us. This is God's design for us. He designed us with this notion of a telos, or an endpoint, a goal, something we're going for. And so if in a church you're wanting to do that, you've got to get points at which you say people are going through this particular class, this particular experience, whatever it may be. And at the end, there's an endpoint and you move on to something else. That's part of this. And it's part of how we're actually created, so that we move through something, we move to another level, and that is recognized in this. That's something very different than many of our churches think and our people in our churches think. Many of our people in our churches, I think I remember a church I pastored many, many years ago, a little tiny church that let me be their pastor, wonderful little church. But I remember the hallway of the adult Sunday school classes that were always the same every single week. And there was a young adult room, and there was a middle adult room, and there was a senior adult room, which they called the last class. Well, they were saying that because it was the last class at the end of the hallway, but I always thought, no, it's the last class. And that's the only progression they had in their minds, was young, middle, old. That was it. You just went to the last class, and that was the last one at the end of the hallway. There was no growth beyond that. That's this maintenance mentality. But what we're trying to think of in a continual education mentality is for people to be able to say, I want to grow, and my church is providing me with checkpoints to grow. And this taps into how God made me. And that makes me excited, because I can gain new skills, new knowledge, take new directions because of this continual learning mentality.
Man, I love this. You're getting me excited. Like I can feel your passion. God designed us for goals. We need checkpoints. We need milestones. That is really good stuff. Help me out. So I'm a pastor here at West Bradenton. I am sitting in the last classroom at the end of the hall because my office doesn't have air conditioning right now. So I'm just waiting on somebody to pop through that door right there, because I don't have a sign on the door. And then it's going to be really awkward, and I'm going to love it. But give me a milestone. When you say milestone or a checkpoint, like what would that look like in a church?
So sometimes we have intellectual milestones, so ones that we want somebody to learn something or to master a certain base of knowledge, something like that, or read a particular book. Those are kind of the easy ones, and those aren't bad. Those are simple, but they're not bad. But one of the things that we sometimes need to do is recognize that in leadership and in our churches, we will replicate what we celebrate. And whatever we celebrate, that's what we replicate. So part of it is to have points at which we celebrate the achievement of moving through certain experiences, knowledge, things like that. So that could be, this is in family ministry. One of the things that is really important to do is to set up particular milestones throughout a child's life of things they achieve, and then we celebrate that with the child and with the parents. Many cultures around the world have that. We kind of have lost that in many Western cultures. You think about this, that in certain cultures, it's very clear when you move from one step to the next, from childhood to adulthood, things like that. There's very clear demarcations. With us, is it 18? Is it 16? Is it 21? When is it? How do I know when I grow up? Well, one of the things we as a church can do is set up milestones that aren't driven by a particular age, but by a particular experience. We want to prepare you. One of the things I did as a pastor in a church is to have a certain high demand mission trip in the senior year of high school, somewhere toward the end of the senior year of high school. But it wasn't just about that mission trip. It was about years of preparation to be able to do that, and showing a certain level of commitment. This was a learning experience about cultures, about the Bible, about evangelism leading up to that. And then you went to this amazing mission trip that was generally a life-changing experience for these students. So we can use mission trips to mark these things and then celebrate those things. But whatever we do, it has to be marked, and not merely marked but celebrated and recognized that this is something that has you've accomplished. This is something you've moved toward, and that there's another step of life for you that's next after this. But we can do that with adults as well. We do it in some sense. We don't celebrate it enough. But for example, baptism ought to be seen as that. There ought to be preparation going up to baptism and help after baptism. But then after that, what do people do after that? Well, what if we have a series of 3 or 4 classes that go over 3 or 4 years, in which we are step by step, we are strengthening your understanding of the faith, and we are then celebrating each step of that along the way. That's what we're talking about in this type of continual learning attitude.
Hmm. Well, I know that several churches, especially in the Baptist denomination, used to have things like Baptist Union. A lot of churches now, you'll see things, they almost all seem to call it Institute. So there's a number of learning environments that do kind of celebrate that. And I think you're exactly right. I want to echo what you've already said there with the almost what you call that maintaining that trellis of just weekly biblical study with a group of people. And there's value to that. But then there's also a great value to what I would call more classes instead of groups that are, they've got a start and an end. They've got a topic. They've got a mixture. You start again, you pick up some things. And where I've seen a lot of churches thrive is creating almost, I mean, for lack of a better word, a degree program or a pathway. And you hear people say things like, give them a path, not a menu. I've always kind of argued give them both. And sometimes the menu gets them on the path. And so I think that's worth repeating, that both are worth doing. And you can even use the second kind, the pathway, towards leading maybe some of those groups. There should be a pathway of courses, and now you celebrate. We're going to launch out a new group, those sort of things.
Yeah, and one of the ways we can think about this is just to think of the notion. It's an old word, and we use it in academic circles, but a curriculum is what we're talking about. And I know we use that just for the paper stuff we print, or for the the different old time language quarterlies, things like that. But it's not about the content there. The curriculum, the true curriculum, is the experience of a life together. It's a circle you're going in, so to speak, a cycle of learning that is growing you and developing you. That's what a true curriculum really is. And we should think in terms of that in our churches.
So help me understand how this can impact church staff. Now, a lot of our listeners are sole pastors or bivocational pastors, but there's still plenty that have a staff. It might be 1, 2, or 3 people that serve on staff part-time or full-time. What does that, when you have this culture of continual education, continual learning, what does that do for the team that kind of administrates the church?
Well, I'll say one of the things negative it can do, and then a lot of positive things. And I say this because I've been in that situation that many of the listeners are, of being a solo pastor. And one of the errors I made early on is trying to do this type of thing and do all of it myself, to teach it all myself. And what I realized after a few years of that is what I had to do before I did that was to train up a group of people who could sustain it, because I couldn't sustain it by myself. So what I want to, first off, is if that person's out there saying, my goodness, I've got 50 people in my church, how can I do this entire curriculum you're talking about? And I'm going to say, you can't. You can't do it. But you probably have 4 people in your church who could. And if you would spend a year training them, that group first, then give them each, you do this course, you do this one, you do this one, put them in sequence. You could do that. And so that's my encouragement. It can become a drag on you, but it doesn't have to. It doesn't have to. In terms of the positive things that this does, is as for your members, it really does help them become more self-motivated, because they're jumping into a class, they're achieving a goal, that putting that goal in front of them and helping them to achieve it and celebrate it, that helps them to be more self-motivated. But here's what's most important to me, really, is that it helps them to be more doctrinally secure. And I use that term very deliberately, doctrinally secure. Now, when I say that, I don't mean everybody believes exactly the same thing. Obviously, there's parameters of our confessions of faith that they need to believe within, but doctrinally secure doesn't mean doctrinally identical. What it means is that they know their spot within the parameters of the church's statement of faith, and they're secure in that in such a way that they don't have to fight for the particulars that may often divide people. The people that you really train up in this way, if you do good doctrinal training with them, they're not going to be fighting with other church members over their view of the millennium. They're not going to be getting at odds with one another on these issues that are secondary and tertiary issues. They're going to recognize there's a parameter that we are within as a church. We're going to live within that. But I can be secure where I am, and I don't have to fight everybody else in that. That helps us understand that. So it helps us set those doctrinal parameters to say, this is what we practice and believe within this. Here's where we're at. But it also helps them to understand the range of options within that, to know where they're at, and to be at peace with their brothers and sisters. In somewhat of a paradoxical way of thinking, the more we teach people about their theology, the less likely they are to fight with their fellow church members over their theology. The more they actually learn in that.
I think you're onto something, and I think you're right. Because the people that seem to be most agitated, and I'm going to talk in generalities, just generalities. The people that seem to be the most agitated are often the ones that are the least informed. And that certainly applies to the church, politics, you name, whatever. And I'm not one to say the world is full of nuance. I tend to be more black and white kind of person. But you do begin to understand what you don't know the further you get along in this progression of learning. Like, man, there's a whole world of things that I just don't know. And that does humble you.
Yeah.
It really does humble you. So, Timothy, I think you're onto something. Josh, I have a question for you. Have you ever preached through Revelation verse by verse?
No, no, that scares me to death. And
I did.
But yeah,
last year.
I know people do that. If you do it right now, I know a bunch of friends that are preaching through. It seems to be the hot thing right now, and your attendance will go up. And so there's an approach to that. You can do it for church growth, or you can do it for doctrine. But there's two things there. I would just say that how funny it is on occasion when you do get pulled into a couple members that are squabbling over some sort of doctrinal issue. I can't tell you how many times one of them I agree with, but I have to pull off to the side and go, I agree with you, but how you got there was wrong, or like you're not even fully understanding what you're saying. Like, and so there's always those opportunities. Timothy, I've got a slight nuance here. You're talking about, because I do see the world as much more nuanced than Sam does. You're talking about theological education and those sort of things. Personally, I've debated around and am currently thinking about pursuing, like postdoctoral certificates from like the universities that I serve near. We have a lot of graduates from the University of North Texas in our church and around our church. And sometimes I think they offer these certificates in things like strategic leadership or, those sort of things. Speak to me about your thoughts on how sometimes just the continuing education isn't necessarily learning more theology for some of us, but maybe going in different directions, and how that might benefit the church as a whole or the pastor.
Yeah, I think it really can at times, and I think we need to distinguish. And as somebody who I would go to school forever, so I'm doing a second PhD right now just for fun, because I'm that type of bizarre person. But because of that, I'm also deeply aware of certain things that sometimes we do it just as a hobby for ourselves, as opposed to something that benefits our church. And if I were in a church right now as a pastor full-time, as rather than a professor, I would be conceiving of what I'm doing quite differently. And so I think one of the things, I'm speaking to me, I have to guard against myself. I would study all sorts of things, mostly history of the Roman Empire, stuff like that. I would just be studying that all the time, just and call it my continuing education. But really, it's just I really enjoy this stuff on that. And so I think we have to ask ourselves whether some people are bent toward leadership, some people are bent toward history, some are philosophy, whatever it may be. Am I doing this to serve my church, or am I doing this to entertain me? I think that's the
Mm,
real thing. We have to dig into our heart and really ask ourselves that. But that's also true if you go back to seminary to do a doctoral work or anything like that. You just need to ask yourself that and be honest with yourself and with the church about that.
mhm,
I think every pastor pretty much ought to at some point go get a doctor of ministry degree, but I want them to do it in a field and in a way that is truly to serve their church, that really is benefiting that congregation in that. And so, in that, to come back around to what you had originally stated there, I do think that we need to think, what is good for my church? What does my church need? But my encouragement to people too is do something that's a little bit that is going to stretch you a little bit, that's going to
mm,
push you a little bit. Do something that's going to make you uncomfortable a little bit. Now, so that means if you are bent toward the practical, just down to earth, how do I do it on the ground? Then maybe you ought to do a D-Min or something like that in applied theology. Maybe that's what you ought to do if that's something that's going to push you theologically. If you're somebody who wants to live up in the ethereal clouds of the highest levels of philosophy and theology, you know what? You probably ought to really think about doing something in counseling or organizational leadership or something like that, because you probably need it. So
right.
my counsel to people often, and I talk to students about this a lot, and they like, I want to do this degree. And it's like, okay, what's your inclination, and what could we do that to stretch you a little bit? Because that's part of this continual learning type of an idea for the pastor, for the church leader, is how do we not merely learn more of what is already comfortable for us, but how do we learn some things that make us uncomfortable, that
Mm,
stretch us to make us a better leader? So when I did my doctorate, I had to do classes, and I love the history, theology, all that, and the education side I enjoy too. The strategic leadership, actually not my thing. It really isn't my thing. I had to take a couple of classes, seminars in strategic leadership, and I can say with absolute confidence that I would not have successfully and effectively led the church I led for the next several years after that to the place where I led them had I not been stretched in some really uncomfortable ways in those leadership classes. I didn't
mm,
want to take them. I wouldn't have taken them. Give me a class on the philosophy of education any day, but I took them, and they helped me because it pushed me in an area that I wasn't comfortable in. So it's just an encouragement. Whatever you do as a church leader in continuing education, make sure it benefits your church, but also make
mhm,
sure it stretches you and doesn't just give you more of what you've already got.
mm.
All right,
Good.
last question. Last question. I'm going to put both of you on the spot. Um, book recommendations. Let's do some book non-church, non-theology book recommendations. So, Josh, what have you read lately that's not like practical church leadership or theological in nature that you would say, yeah, this is a really helpful book or a good book or a fun book or whatever?
I mean, yeah, that does put me on the spot because the last three books that I read, I kind of go through this rotation. One's theological, and so I just finished this book about Psalms 23 and Jesus being the shepherd leader. Then it was a John Grisham book, and then it was a
Okay.
history of the city that I live in. So I read this thick book. It's the history of the city I live in, and so if I was going to advise, directly answer your question, pastors, leaders, read on the history of the community you serve. It gave me so much insight into our church is mentioned. We're 180 years old. We're mentioned several times in this book. So I guess roundabout that's the answer, but it's not the kind of answer that most of our listeners want to go read.
No, I
But
think that's great because
yeah,
most communities do have some history book about them. You probably find it at the local library,
hmm,
eBay. The people who have been around for a while probably have a copy on their shelf, may even
yep,
have an extra copy. When I was in Murray, Kentucky, there was a history about the church that had been written
yep.
and a history about the community. Read that. I think that's a great suggestion. All right, Timothy. I'm going to get that wrong every single time. What book would you recommend to our audience?
I would say so. I read a lot of novels, so I really try to. I think that enriches our understanding of people, and so I've read recently. a novel. It's a science fiction novel, a classic one called The Voyage to Arcturus by David Lindsay. And it's this meandering science fiction novel. I've read, let's see, I've read several Cormac McCarthy books over a period of time. So those are some of the things. I think it helps us to read. And Wendellberry, a lot of Wendellberry books, novels. So those are some of those. So reading science fiction as well as some of those that are really grounded in a sense of place, like Wendellberry, especially helps you to think through and understand people better. And I find that's one of the things that are the non-theology books that I read are often novels. And so I will read a lot of novels. And I do read, and C.S. Lewis kind of falls in that odd category as well. Is it really theological or is it not at times in some of his works? I am always reading something at any given time by C.S. Lewis in that. And so that would be something. I think most of what I try to read are things that are intended to help me think through and be more empathetic with how other people think. I want to be able to understand the human self better, so that when I hear from somebody, I can think of them more holistically. And I really think fiction really helps us to do that. And that's why I read it, because that's an area that I think I struggle with at times. And so I try to read in that area to help me to do that more effectively.
Well, that's a really good suggestion. Hello to all of our Henry County people in Kentucky. You mentioned Wendellberry and the Berry family. So for those of you who are in that area, you live the life that he writes about. So there you go. I will make a suggestion. I will say that you need to go read The Way I Heard It by Mike Rowe. And that book will teach you more about how to do sermon illustrations and how to tell a story more than any book on preaching.
And he has a podcast as well. I have not read the book, but I've listened to his podcast, and I am always in awe of how he can tell a story where he leaves out the information that's important till the end and surprises you. It's this beautiful element of surprise he has in that. Excellent guide to how to tell a story.
I want to preach the way he tells a story. I wish I could do, and I wish I had his voice too. But just a normal dude who grew up in a normal family in Baltimore, Maryland, who quote unquote made it but really didn't, and a fascinating story himself. So yeah, The Way I Heard It by Mike Rowe. Well, thank you, Timothy, Paul, Jones, and Southern Seminary. Again, go check out that fully online PhD program. The link is actually sbts.edu/Rainer, not Rainier. It will not take you to the right place. sbts.edu/Rainer. And we also want to thank our sponsor, Church Teams. Church Teams has been a phenomenal partner for us. They handle technology for churches. They do systems. They do software. They do, databases and text to give and all sorts of things. If it's technology related, more than likely they can help you. So I want to point you to Church Teams. I do know that some of you have actually reached out to us and said, hey, you've been talking about Church Teams. I reached out to them, love what they do, love the service, and I love the resource that they have as well. So go to go.churchteams.com. Again, go.churchteams.com. Hey, if you're looking for a church management software systems provider, they're the ones that you should go get. So thank you, Boyd Pelly and his team, for being such a great service provider at Church Teams. Well, that's all the time that we have for today's episode. Josh and I will be back in a week. We'll have another episode here in a few days. Remember, 2 episodes per week. We're excited about that, to continue to provide you free content. We are on the YouTubes. We're on the airwaves. Wherever you can get a podcast, we should be there. If not, let us know, and we'll try to add it to that particular podcast software app. But we'll see you next time on the next episode.